Hi, everyone. My name is Sarojini Rangam. I'm the ILPS Vice Chair for Asia Pacific. My name is Sarojini, and I'm with the ILPS Vice Chair for Asia Pacific region. Welcome to our webinar, Importance and Program of the National Democratic Revolution. This is the second of a three-part webinar series, and it is part of the International League for People's Struggles, or ILPS, Month of Solidarity for the Philippines. The first part, titled The Philippines as a Semi-Colonial and Semi-Feudal State, Economy, Politics, and Culture, was conducted last September 4th, 2020. Today, we have a great lineup of panelists. And we have Prof. Jose Maria Sison, Chairperson Emeritus of the ILPS, and Renato Reyes, General Secretary of the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, Bayan, and Helda Kasmi, Chairperson of Seruni. But before we begin, I ask everyone to offer their solidarity to Philippine activists who have been murdered by state forces in the last few months. Carlito Badion, Jory Porquia, Randall Itanis, Zara Alvarez. Again, Carlito Badion, Jory Porquia, Randall Itanis, and Zara Alvarez. We like to remember them again, and I like to mention again their names. Carlito Badion, Jory Porquia, Randall Itanis, Zara Alvarez. Their names, along with the countless others, are forever etched in the Hall of Heroes, etched in our hearts and minds. Rest in power, comrades, rest in power. Our first panelist is the Chairperson Emeritus of the ILPS, the Chief Political Consultant of the Negotiating Panel of the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, and a founder of the Communist Party of the Philippines. He will present his paper, Importance of National Democratic Revolution in the Global Anti-Imperialist Movement in the context of the raging contradictions of US and China. Let us welcome Professor Jose Maria Sison.
Dear webinar participants, first of all, I thank ILPS Asia Pacific for inviting me to speak on the importance of the National Democratic Revolution in the Philippines in relation to the global anti-imperialist movement and in the context of the raging contradictions among the imperialists, especially the US and China. In my presentation, I wish to present first the context of the worsening crisis of the world capitalist system and the raging conflicts among the imperialist powers, especially the US and China. Then I shall present the historical and current importance of the National Democratic Revolution, not only to the Filipino people, but to all the peoples in the Asia-Pacific region and the whole world. As the crisis of the world capitalist system worsens, with the aggravation by COVID 19 and by the sharpening conflicts between the US and China, there is an urgent need for all peoples of the world to understand the situation in our respective countries, in the Asia Pacific region and entire world. In this regard, let us learn from each other and help each other in waging anti-imperialist and democratic struggles. After enjoying 3 decades of prosperity from 1945 to 1975, the US began to be afflicted by stagflation. This was due to the crisis of overproduction in the world capitalist system because of the reconstruction and revival of the competitive economies of capitalist countries, especially Germany and Japan, which had suffered devastation from World War II. The US adopted the neoliberal economic policy in 1979 in a futile attempt to overcome the crisis of overproduction at the expense of the working class and the peoples of the world. The logic of the policy is to maximize by all means the amount of capital in the hands of the monopoly bourgeoisie so that it can reinvest this to grow the economy and supposedly create more jobs. The neoliberal policy would actually aggravate the crisis of overproduction, bringing about more frequent and ever worse cycles of boom and bust. Maximizing capital in the hands of the monopoly bourgeoisie has been done through tax cuts, wage freeze, limits on job tenure, cutbacks on social benefits and services, privatization of public assets, deregulation of restraints on the abuse of labor, women, children, and the environment, liberalization of investment and trade, and denationalization of underdeveloped and dependent economies. The imperialist powers used their multilateral agencies to make multilateral arrangements to harmonize their economic and trade relations and shift the burden of crisis to the underdeveloped countries. Emerging from its costly wars of aggression in Indochina, the US hoped to make profits from military sales to the oil-producing countries and expand production with the use of petrodollars deposited in Western banks. At the same time, the US succeeded in engaging the Soviet Union in an arms race in order to undermine and debilitate its economy, while the Soviet social imperialists were making big mistakes in their foreign adventures, especially in Afghanistan. The revisionist betrayal of socialism and capitalist restoration ran ahead in the Soviet Union, but subsequently the Chinese revisionists headed by Deng Xiaoping were able to defeat the great proletarian cultural revolution in 1976 with a counter-revolutionary coup after the death of Mao Zedong. The US had started rapprochement with China in 1972 in order to take advantage of the Sino-Soviet dispute, but from 1978 onwards, the US saw its far greater opportunity to cultivate China as a capitalist partner upon the declaration of the GPCR as a complete catastrophe and upon the adoption of the Dengist policy of capitalist reforms and opening up for integration into the world capitalist system. In the entire 1980s, the US outsourced consumer manufacturing to China's sweatshops. And after the 1989 uprisings in Tiananmen and elsewhere in China, the US acceded to the pleas of China's Dengist leaders to bring in more investments and technology to China. In the 1990s, China became the main US partner in the promotion of the neoliberal policy of imperialist globalization, and more so after China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001. The US was so happy and jubilant over the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991 and over the partnership with China that it overlooked the potential of two more imperialist powers, China and Russia, joining the world capitalist system to aggravate the crisis of overproduction in the world capitalist system. As sole superpower and hubris in a supposedly unipolar world, the US could not see clearly the possible aggravation of the crisis of overproduction and its continued strategic decline. With the single message that socialism was dead and so was anti-imperialism, the US carried out an ideological and political offensive in combination with the neoliberal economic offensive and the military offensives in the Middle East and other regions where, in combination with Zionist Israel, they acted to fill the vacuum left by the Soviet Union. The heavy cost of military expenditures and the aggravated crisis of overproduction accelerated the strategic decline of the US and caused the loss of its sole superpower status in a multilateral world. In the years after the 2008 financial crisis, which resulted in an unprecedented global recession, the US strategic planners noticed the economic and military rise of China as a potential US economic and political rival. At the same time, it was becoming starkly clear that the US was on an accelerated decline because of the outsourcing of manufacturing, the financialization of the US economy, the leap in public debt, and the extreme cost of overseas military bases and the endless wars of aggression, mainly in Central Asia, Middle East, and Africa. Under the Obama presidency, the US took notice that it had not paid enough attention to the rise of China in the Asia-Pacific region. Thus, it declared a strategic pivot to East Asia in order to contain China in 2011 and push the Trans-Pacific Partnership Arrangement without China in 2015. Under the Trump presidency, the U.S. strategic planners issued the National Security Strategy in 2017 to target China as the U.S. chief economic competitor and chief political rival. Subsequently, Trump began in 2018 to denounce China as taking advantage of a two-tiered economy, the state and private capitalism, using unfair economic, trade, and financial practices, and stealing technology from U.S. companies and research laboratories. Since then, there has been a sharpening of U.S.-China contradictions over economic, trade, technology, and security issues. The U.S. wants to cut down China's export surpluses in trade with the U.S. and weaken the Chinese economy and deprive it of the surplus capital to invest globally and dominate the countries covered by the Belt and Road Initiative, as well as the South China Sea and the Indo-Pacific maritime route through which some 60% of world trade passes. The U.S. expects to benefit from a new Cold War, this time with China, but it has huge problems in decoupling from China and recovering the concessions and advantages it had given away. And China has the size and experience in using state planning to counter the U.S. and to hold its ground. But it is sitting on a mountain of bad debts and has been dependent on the trade surplus with the U.S. for a long time. It is more likely that the two imperialist powers would weaken each other, while surely aggravating further the crisis of overproduction and the danger of more wars due to increasing confrontations in the Asia-Pacific region and elsewhere. At any rate, it is important to consider the consequences of the U.S.-China conflicts to the Philippines and other countries of the world. The U.S. used to claim that with China abandoning the socialist cause and proletarian internationalism and withdrawing support from the revolutionary movements, the anti-imperialist, democratic, and socialist struggles of the people would wither away. They have not withered away, but have resurged at every worsening of the global capitalist crisis. We can learn one major thing from developments since the defeat of the GPCR in 1976, that the increase in number of rival imperialist powers has aggravated the crisis of overproduction and has generated favorable conditions for anti-imperialist struggles and the resurgence of the world proletarian revolution. Now let us focus on the historic and current importance of the National Democratic Revolution in the Philippines. In the whole of Asia, the Filipino people, led by the Katipunan, were pioneers in waging the National Democratic Revolution of the bourgeois liberal type in 1896 and in winning national independence against Spanish colonialism in 1898, we achieved the great historic feat of defeating one Western colonial power impelled by mercantilist capitalism, but came another Western power to colonize us on the impulse of monopoly capitalism or imperialism. We valiantly resisted the war of aggression launched by U.S. imperialism, which engaged in the mass murder of at least 250,000 Filipinos to consolidate its positions in Manila and other major cities by 1902, and proceeded to kill more people, up to 1.5 million, by 1913. It was through bloody conquest that the U.S. was able to establish a colonial and semi-feudal system in the Philippines. Since 1946, when the U.S. granted nominal independence, the Philippines has become its semi-colony, run by the political representatives of the local exploiting classes of big compradors and landlords at the national and lower levels of a puppet government, still under the economic and political, military and cultural dominance of U.S. imperialism. In the era of modern imperialism and proletarian revolution, the National Democratic Revolution in the Philippines has taken a new character, with the proletariat rather than the liberal bourgeoisie taking the lead in the revolutionary struggle of the broad masses of the people against foreign and feudal domination. It seeks the national and social liberation of the people from imperialism and the local exploiting classes and looks forward to a socialist future. The immediate demands of the National Democratic Revolution include the following: full national independence, democracy, social justice, economic development through genuine land reform and national industrialization, a national scientific and mass culture, and international solidarity with all peoples for peace and development. The most powerful forces of the Filipino people in today's National Democratic Revolution are the Communist Party of the Philippines, the New People's Army, the millions of people, and the revolutionary mass organizations of workers, peasants, indigenous communities, women, youth, professionals, and other social sectors which are in the National Democratic Front of the Philippines, and the greater millions of people under the local organs of political power, which constitute the People's Democratic Government, now challenging the reactionary government of big compradors and landlords. The CPP is guided by the theory of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism, and adheres to the general line of People's Democratic Revolution through protracted People's War. From a few scores of members in 1968, it now has tens of thousands of members who are spread nationwide and are deeply rooted among the oppressed and exploited masses of workers and peasants. The CPP has created and led the New People's Army, which has thousands of red fighters and more than 110 guerrilla fronts in 73 out of 81 Philippine provinces. The People's Army is augmented by tens of thousands of People's Militia members and hundreds of thousands of people and self-defense units of the revolutionary mass organizations, which are different from the legal democratic forces now being red-tagged by the state terrorists and their special agents like the clerico-fascists and Trotskyites. The People's Army is invincible because it is the weapon of the Filipino people and their just struggle for full national independence, democracy, and social justice against the extremely oppressive and exploitative ruling system. Thus, all the strategic operational plans of the U.S. and its puppets have failed to destroy the NPA and the revolutionary mass movement from the time of Marcos to Duterte, or from one tyrant to another. The revolutionary perseverance, resilience, and achievements of the Filipino proletariat and people in the National Democratic Revolution of the new type can be evaluated not only in terms of Philippine history and current circumstances, but also in terms of how this revolution has withstood the revisionist betrayal of socialism and restoration of capitalism in the former Soviet Union and China, and the consequent huge ideological, political, and economic offensives of the U.S. and all its imperialist and reactionary allies. With the strategic economic and political partnership of the US and China breaking up, the current Duterte puppet regime tries to serve two conflicting imperialist masters for its selfish benefit. The regime still keeps the treaties, agreements, and arrangements that make the US the number one imperialist power dominating the Philippines as its semi-colony. The US has condoned the regime's gross and systematic violations of human rights because of its pledge to use all foul means to destroy the armed revolutionary movement of the people and to cause charter change for granting to US corporations unlimited ownership of land, natural resources, public utilities, and all types of businesses in the Philippines. At the same time, the regime receives bribes in connection with high-interest loans for overpriced infrastructure projects to be undertaken by Chinese contractors, as well as from Chinese criminal syndicates smuggling illegal drugs and other contraband and operating casinos in the Philippines. In exchange, the regime has laid aside the 2016 final judgment of the Permanent Arbitration Court and the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, which uphold the sovereign and maritime rights of the Filipino people over the West Philippine Sea. It abets China in building and militarizing artificial islands in the Philippine exclusive economic zone and in illegally claiming the marine and mineral resources of the Filipino people. An absurd situation has arisen in the camps of the reactionary armed forces. The US maintains its military personnel, stockpiles, and facilities in these camps under certain military agreements with the reactionary government. At the same time, the regime has allowed China Telcom, DITO Telecommunity, to erect cell towers within the same camps. China has also delivered stockpiles of firearms and explosives, which most soldiers in the pro-US military do not like to use, and which are being sold to private security agencies and gun runners by corrupt military officers. It is an interesting question how long and how far can the Duterte regime serve two conflicting imperialist masters without getting squeezed or squashed. The US still considers the Philippines as its reliable base and unsinkable aircraft carrier, but China has now spy towers eavesdropping on US military facilities, and it has 7 island military bases in the Philippine exclusive economic zone. The US assures the Philippines and other littoral states of Southeast Asia of protection from China's illegal claim of owning 90% of the South China Sea. But in this regard, Duterte joins China against the ASEAN colleagues of the Philippines. As the crisis of the world capitalist system now worsens, the National Democratic Revolution in the Philippines stands out as one of the major torchbearers of the global anti-imperialist movement and the resurgence of the world proletarian revolution. It is a source of light and lessons for all peoples of the world in developing the various forms of anti-imperialist and democratic struggles, especially revolutionary struggle. Thus, US imperialism has licensed the Duterte regime to use every foul means to suppress it. Long before the spread of COVID-19 spread, the crisis of the world capitalist system has worsened to the point of generating militant, anti-imperialist, and democratic mass actions of unprecedented magnitude and scale in so many countries, including the industrial capitalist and underdeveloped ones. The people have been agitated by the devastation wrought by the neoliberal policy on their lives, the austerity measures at their expense, the state terrorism and wars of aggression unleashed by the imperialist powers. Despite the COVID-19 pandemic and the restrictions being undertaken, the people have found ways of waging mass resistance through street mass actions and the use of the electronic media. In many instances, because of the extreme policies and actions taken by imperialist and reactionary governments, the people have made responses similar to those made by them in pre-pandemic times. The Filipino people find powerful inspiration and abundant support for their national democratic revolution in the upsurges of anti-imperialist and democratic mass struggles abroad, and are doing their best to carry out their own mass struggles not only on Philippine issues, but also on issues of concern to other peoples. They have engaged in global days of action, as well as forums of various kinds and scales on issues of common concern against imperialism and all reaction. While the imperialists and the reactionaries persist, they are capable of all sorts of violence and deception. Thus, aside from brazenly using the coercive apparatuses of the state to suppress the people, they launch ultra-reactionary currents and movements in order to cover up the root causes of the basic ills of society and try to mislead some sections of the people against the people. Such currents and movements are those of fascism, racism, chauvinism, communalism, gender discrimination, and Islamophobia. These have produced some effect in the election of the despotic type of leader through the electoral system controlled by the exploitative ruling class. It is quite comical that US imperialism is deploying its Trotskyite hirelings to attack the CPP, the revolutionary forces in the NDFP, and a broad range of legal democratic forces for supposedly enabling and supporting the Duterte terror regime, to use anti-Stalin stock phrases and deny the revolutionary leadership of the proletariat and the necessity of the new democratic and socialist stages in the Philippine Revolution, to demand that the People's War be liquidated and that socialism be the main issue under semi-colonial and semi-feudal conditions, and yet pontificate that socialism is impossible in any single country. In brief, the Trotskyites are being farcical in once more playing their worn-out role as anti-Stalin and anti-communist agents of US imperialism and the local reactionaries. The global anti-imperialist movement must always be alert to the full range of deceptions and barbarities that imperialist powers and their puppets commit in the violation of the basic national and democratic rights and fundamental freedoms of the people, and in the suppression of the demands, complaints, and protests of the people. The crimes against the people range in kind from brutal frontal attacks of state terrorism or aggression to tactics of turning people against each other through methods of deception. In continuing the national democratic revolution against tremendous odds, including the most brutal forms of suppression, the Filipino people demonstrate their determination, courage, and capabilities to fight the imperialists and reactionaries. At the same time, they find common cause with the peoples of the world and seek international solidarity and support from them against imperialism and all reaction. As the crisis of the world capital system is rapidly worsening, there is an urgent need for the people of the world to fight the escalating conditions of oppression and exploitation, and to stop the plunder and degradation of the environment by monopoly capitalism. The revolutionary strength of the people is also needed to counter and stop the danger of direct world war among the imperialist powers and the attendant danger of a nuclear war of annihilation. The imperialist powers can be defeated and disarmed by the people in their homelands if their revolutionary mass movement is strong enough to confront and overcome them. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Sison. That was really good. Enjoyed listening to the how you talked about the National Democratic Revolution and its placement in the tension between two imperial powers, namely the United States of America and China. And your main points are very relevant as the anti-imperialist movement in Asia and the world grapples with the current conditions faced by the movement. Many of you are already wanting to ask questions and comment on Professor Sison's presentation, you may do so by clicking on the question and answer button found at the bottom of the Zoom interface and type in your questions and comments. I think there are already some questions for Professor Sison, and I think we will try to answer those at the later in our program. So now we turn to our next presentation. Our next panelist is the General Secretary of the Bagong Alyansang Makabayan, or Bayan. He's the convener of many networks and alliances in the Philippines, advocating for societal change, and is the founding General Secretary of the youth group Anak Bayan. Please, Mr. Renato Reyes, please, please make your presentation. Thank you.
All right. So I would be presenting for Bayan on the National Democratic Program. So this is just a brief presentation. So are you able to see the shared screen? All right. Okay, so the National Democratic Program and Alternative is based on the existing social conditions in the Philippines. As explained by Professor Sison, we are in a semi-feudal, semi-colonial society in the era of modern imperialism, and that this requires a two-stage revolution under the leadership of the working class. Now, we from Bayan, we are part of the legal democratic movement. Bayan is a multi-sectoral alliance founded in 1985 at the height of the struggle against the US-backed Marcos dictatorship. Our members include unions, peasant associations, women, youth organizations, indigenous peoples, professionals, church workers, and so on. So we're part of the legal democratic movement that is waging the national democratic struggle in the Philippines. So here it is. So it is unarmed, legal and defensive, and pushing for the national and social liberation of the Filipino people. So our struggle is to unite the people to overthrow imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism, and achieve national and social liberation for the Filipino people, and build a socialist future and contribute to the global struggle against imperialism, fascism, and all reaction. So the first on the program, the NG program and alternative, the first is to unite the people for national liberation, unite the people to end the semi-feudal and semi-colonial social system, and complete the democratic stage of the revolution. So this will entail organizing and mobilizing the people and building a broad alliance against imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism, and isolating and defeating the most reactionary clique one after the other. So we have been able to oust two regimes, the Marcos dictatorship and the Estrada regime, and we are now confronted with the challenge of taking on the fascist Duterte regime, which is subservient to both the US and China. Second on the program, upon the overthrow of imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism, we are to establish a People's Democratic Republic and a democratic coalition government. So this would also require the broad unity of the working class, the peasantry, the patriotic and progressive classes. So it's called coalition government of the working class in a close alliance with the peasantry. And the seeds of this new government is being planted even today in various parts of the country through the local organs of political power of the people. And the new government, led by the working class, in alliance with the peasantry and other oppressed classes, would push for genuine democracy and the democratic of the most oppressed sectors of society. Third, in the program alternative, the national defense. Uh, we need to build a national defense system in the service of the people. The gains of the struggle must be protected against all forms of imperialist aggression and efforts of the deposed reactionaries to return to power. The People's Army will serve the people and protect national sovereignty and defend our territorial integrity. This includes the archipelago as well as the West Philippine Sea and the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. Number 4, democratic rights. We are fighting to uphold and promote people's democratic rights. The democratic rights of the most oppressed shall be promoted, expanded, and guaranteed, foremost of which the democratic demands of the peasantry will have to be achieved. So the main democratic demand for the ND revolution would be the demand for land reform, the basic demand of emancipating the peasantry from feudal bondage. Next, the NG program and alternative national interest. We are fighting to terminate all relations with states and other foreign entities. This would mean the termination of the Cold War era Mutual Defense Treaty, the Visiting Forces Agreement, the Enhanced Defense Cooperation Agreement, and other honors deals with China. The US VFA, for example, right now has been very controversial because Duterte gave absolute pardon to a US Marine who was convicted of killing trans woman, Filipino trans woman, and did not even serve his full sentence and did not spend a single day in a Philippine jail because he was given special treatment under the Visiting Forces Agreement. And this is an affront to our sovereignty. It's an affront to our national dignity, and we have to do away with these agreements and have the Philippines stand on its own 2 feet in dealing with the various challenges, including the challenges of China in the West Philippine Sea. So it's about asserting our national sovereignty and national interests in all spheres, and the Democratic Republic shall oppose all forms of foreign intervention and interference in the country's internal affairs. So these are just a few of our protest actions that we do. A protest against the Visiting Forces Agreement and a protest against illegal reclamation activities and militarization of the West Philippine Sea. Number 6 on the ND program is land reform. So we want to implement genuine agrarian reform, promote agricultural cooperation, rural production and employment through modernization of agriculture and industrialization, and ensure agricultural sustainability is the main democratic demand in the ND struggle. If you have been following the peace negotiations in the Philippines between the NDFP and the GRP, the Government of the Republic of the Philippines, you would see that a lot of attention is being put on land reform, on economic, socioeconomic reform. And land reform is and rural modernization are among the main agenda being pushed even in the peace negotiations. Number 7, and program national industrialization. So along with land reform, we aim to break the U.S. big comprador landlord dominance over the economy and carry out national industrialization and build an independent, self-reliant economy. This will be done, of course, with a socialist framework, which is the meeting of people's needs and not private profit margins. Now, national industrialization is such an important issue right now as exposed by the pandemic. We are in the worst economic crisis for the past 5 decades, and the Philippines is really reeling from recession and record unemployment. And we do not have our own industry. We are so dependent on the global economy. We are so dependent on sending overseas Filipinos abroad. And that's why we are very weak economically. And we are really feeling the effects of the economic crisis worsened by the pandemic. So in the future, we hope to break that. We hope to break free from that situation and establish the basic industries, including that would benefit the Filipino people. Next on the program is pushing for a progressive social policy. So adopting a comprehensive social policy and progressive social policy. This is putting social services at the forefront, putting healthcare for the people as a priority. Right now in the Philippines, if you look at the national budget, even if we are in the middle of a raging pandemic, healthcare is number 5, just number 5 in the priorities for spending. So ahead of healthcare is national defense and the interior and local government. So these are the repressive apparatus of the Duterte regime, and they have the lion's share in the national budget. And healthcare does not receive the amount that it should have, especially we are confronting a health crisis. Then we need also progressive environmental policy. We're pushing for nationalist, scientific, and pro-people-oriented education. We're pushing for mass-based housing program, social protection, consumer rights, and so on. Number 9, people's culture. So we aim to promote a national and progressive people's culture. Cultural revolution has been ongoing, is ongoing right now, and this involves progressive art, literacy, education. We're pushing for culture that is patriotic, progressive, popular, rejecting the feudal culture and the feudal notions. We're pushing for an end to foreign and corporate ownership of mass media and so part of our program is to uphold the rights of the Bangsamoro in southern Philippines and the Cordillera people and other indigenous peoples and their right to self-determination and democracy. We hope to build the Philippines where there's unity, equality, and brotherhood of all peoples and nationalities, and to forge a nation that is founded upon real independence from imperialism and democracy for the people and genuine autonomy. The struggle of the indigenous peoples right now is very intense because they are being targeted by militarization in the countryside, and there have been displacement, illegal arrest, killings, and other forms of human rights violations directed against the indigenous peoples and the Moro peoples. Number 11, women's liberation. So we are advancing the revolutionary emancipation of women in all spheres. This is ongoing even now in Portugal. We are pushing for full participation and democratic representation of women in government, economic organizations, and social institutions. We also promote reproductive rights and including the right to divorce. Fun fact, in the Philippines, we do not have a divorce law. We are among the very few remaining countries in the world that does not recognize divorce. And lastly, number 12, foreign policy. We want to adopt an active, independent, and peaceful foreign policy. The People's Democratic State shall pursue an active, independent, and peaceful foreign policy. The new government shall reject and vigorously defend itself against all forms of foreign intervention and interference in the country's internal affairs from all other states. Of course, we want to promote international solidarity and peace. So this is very different from the current Duterte administration claims to promote an independent foreign policy, but is actually subservient to different imperialist masters. So lastly, solidarity. The Philippine mass movement is in solidarity with the anti-imperialist, anti-fascist, and democratic struggles of the oppressed peoples of the world. We likewise appreciate the solidarity of the different movements and organizations supporting the struggles of the Filipino people for national liberation and democracy. We hope our brief presentation on what we're fighting for, what we're trying to build, the National Democratic Program, will further deepen the understanding among our allies of what we are currently fighting for and what we hope to achieve in the future. So maraming salamat and long live national solidarity.
Thank you, Renato. Thank you for your presentation. And, looking at the situation of the current socioeconomic crisis gripping the Philippines, the rising fascism of the Philippine state, your presentation provides us with the alternatives the movement of the Philippines is working for, the demands and the calls that are so important for Philippines liberation. So again, I just want to remind everyone, for those who want to put their questions and comments to Renato's presentation, please click the question and answer button at the bottom of the Zoom interface and type in your thoughts. We shall soon open the floor for questions, but before this, to give a reaction on the previous presentations, we would like to call Ramat of Agra. I mistakenly said Heda, but now Ramat of Agra and from ILPS Indonesia will be sharing his ideas and comments. He's also a member of the ICC of the ILPS at the global level. And just to remind everyone who are non-Bahasa speakers to go to the English channel to hear the English interpretation. Welcome, Ramat.
Ya, pertama, saya ingin mengucapkan selamat atas kesuksesan dan keberlanjutan Bulan Solidaritas yang dilakukan oleh ILPS Asia Pasifik. Semoga tidak hanya berguna bagi bangsa dan rakyat Filipina, tapi juga bagi bangsa dan rakyat tertindas dan terhisap di seluruh dunia. Bagi Indonesia adalah salah satu keberuntungan bisa belajar tentang gerakan pembebasan rakyat dan bangsa Filipina yang panjang, sabar, dan betul-betul militan, merupakan kehormatan bagi kami ILPS Indonesia disertakan dalam diskusi kali ini. Imperialis Amerika Serikat adalah imperialis yang memiliki kekuasaan tunggal di dunia dan saat ini menghadapi kontradiksi yang tajam dengan kekuatan imperialis dunia lainnya dari negeri-negeri anggota G7. Karena meskipun sudah selesai pembagian dunia secara teritorial di antara kekuatan kapitalisme besar monopoli internasional, akan tetapi kondisi overproduksi yang terus berlipat ganda dan tidak terobati dan mengalami stagnasi ekonomi yang lebih panjang sebagai konsekuensi dari pemulihan krisis yang lebih panjang di negeri imperialis yang mengakibatkan stag. Semua itu memicu persaingan yang lebih tajam dan sengit dan lahirnya ketidakpuasan atas pembagian teritorial antar imperialisme besar, baik secara terbuka ataupun tidak terbuka, meminta pembagian yang lebih besar bagi kepentingan borjuasi nasional di negeri masing-masing. Brexit adalah salah satu bukti dari kapitalis Inggris atas tuntutan untuk mendapatkan pembagian yang lebih besar. Kemenangan Donald Trump yang ingin membawa manufaktur Amerika ke tingkatan sebelum lahirnya neoliberal, membuat Amerika lebih berjaya adalah tuntutan kapitalisme besar Amerika. Negeri lain juga demikian, walau intensitas yang lebih rendah. Keikutsertaan dalam perang imperialis yang lebih agresif seperti Jerman, Jepang, Prancis, Kanada, Italia, dan semua itu dalam kerangka mereka ingin mendapatkan pembagian teritorial yang lebih besar. Tiongkok dan Rusia adalah masalah yang berbeda. Mereka tidak menuntut penghapusan superior Amerika Serikat sebagai negeri imperialis tunggal, tapi di bawah politik revisionisme modern Deng Xiaoping yang diteruskan oleh pemimpinan Tiongkok sesudahnya, menuntut agar Tiongkok diperlakukan sebagai kekuatan besar dunia yang disertakan dengan kekuatan besar dunia yang lainnya. Meskipun Tiongkok dan Rusia telah memiliki hak veto dalam Dewan Keamanan PBB dan memiliki proporsi suara yang lebih cukup dalam badan PBB. Tiongkok berkuasa untuk menjadikan kekuatan imperialis sosial dalam pengertian sesungguhnya. Keluar dari keterbelakangan ekonomi, berusaha untuk menunjukkan kapasitasnya dalam industri manufaktur dan pertanian kapitalis. Secara politik, Tiongkok berusaha mengkalilipatkan kekuatan militer dan memodernisasi tentara pembebasan rakyat serta membangun kapal induk agar bisa melakukan patroli di lautan lepas dan sanggup untuk menciptakan negeri jajahan dan setengah jajahan atas teritorial tertentu di dunia dengan tujuan agar bisa mengoperasionalkan atau mengekspor kapital, menggantikan kedudukan komoditas, ekspor komoditas barang dengan ekspor kapital yang utamanya ke negeri-negeri jajahan atau negeri-negeri setengah jajahan. Karena itu, syarat utamanya Tiongkok harus sanggup menunjukkan tidak hanya membangun kekuatan militer untuk bertahan aktif, melainkan turut campur dalam penyelesaian nasional di negeri tertentu. Pertanyaannya, bisakah Tiongkok menjadi negeri superpower baru secara damai dan begitu saja tanpa perang dunia baru untuk memaksa kekuatan imperialis Amerika Serikat yang paling berkuasa membagi teritorial dunia? Kami di Indonesia sepenuhnya di bawah sistem ekonomi setengah feodal di bawah kekuatan imperialis Amerika Serikat. Karena itu kami adalah negeri setengah jajahan. Sejak konferensi meja bundar yaitu Desember 1949 dan akibat ditek imperialis tersebut, konsekuensinya menciptakan pemerintahan boneka yang berkelanjutan untuk memelihara sistem ekonomi setengah feodal yang sepenuhnya tergantung pada produksi pertanian terbelakang untuk memenuhi komoditas hasil pertanian dengan ekspor komoditas hasil pertanian dengan harga yang murah dan ekstraksi mineral juga untuk kebutuhan ekspor dengan harga yang murah, serta memelihara industri yang bergantung pada bahan baku impor yang berorientasi ekspor. Dan situasi impor tergantung pada paten dan lisensi. Sehingga karena itu hanya industri rakitan assembling yang bermesin paling rendah dan memaksa kelas buruh untuk mengoperasionalkan dalam jam kerja yang panjang dan kecelakaan kerja yang mengancam setiap saat. Komoditas yang dihasilkan industri ini harus murah, karena itu upah buruh pun harus dibayar dengan murah atau mengalami pembekuan dalam waktu yang panjang. Kelas buruh di Indonesia tidak bisa memproduksi tenaga yang baru untuk bekerja besok pagi. Konsekuensinya yang paling fatal, investasi dan utang untuk segala sesuatu yang dibangun di Indonesia. Pemerintahan boneka tidak memiliki kapital sendiri yang cukup tanpa investasi dan utang dari kapitalis besar monopoli internasional. Kaum buruh dan kaum tani bekerja sangat keras untuk membayar utang tersebut dan merelakan upah dan pendapatannya dipotong atau tidak dinaikkan dalam waktu yang lama. Mereka dipaksa agar Indonesia menjadi negara yang menggiurkan bagi ekspor kapital dari negara-negara kapitalis, terutama Amerika Serikat dan negara-negara anggota G7 lainnya, serta Tiongkok. Karena itu saja kami membutuhkan gerakan pembebasan nasional untuk bisa membebaskan diri dari dominasi imperialis yang direpresentasikan oleh negara RI, negara setengah jajahan negara Republik Indonesia. Sebenarnya gerakan pembebasan ini bukan baru kali ini, tapi sudah lama diusahakan oleh rakyat dan bangsa Indonesia. Tidak kurang keberanian dan militansi untuk melakukan itu. Tapi apa daya, kesalahan sendiri demi kesalahan sendiri terulang dari organisasi ataupun pimpinan dari gerakan pembebasan itu sendiri. Karena itu seharusnya bangsa dan rakyat Indonesia tergabung dalam ILPS dan banyak belajar tentang situasinya. Kami sendiri tidak lupa belajar sungguh-sungguh dari pengalaman gerakan pembebasan yang maju dari negeri-negeri lainnya. Seperti saat ini, kawan-kawan dari ILPS Asia Pasifik menyertakan kami dalam forum ini. Kami berusaha memanfaatkannya sebagai ajang kami belajar bagaimana kawan-kawan di Filipina berjuang membebaskan rakyat di dalam negeri dan menghubungkan dengan pembebasan negeri-negeri lain dari imperialis. Senang mendengar kawan-kawan dalam kemajuan cepat dan sangat kuat, belajar dari kekeliruan dan lompatan baru. Salut atas semua capaian dan harapan bisa bersisian dan berharap bisa bersisian dalam front anti-imperialisme di masa depan. Demikian yang bisa saya sampaikan. Sehat dan panjang umur untuk Joma Sison. Jayalah gerakan pembebasan di Filipina. Jayalah gerakan pembebasan di Indonesia dan seluruh dunia. Bersatulah rakyat tertindas dan terhisap di seluruh dunia. Terima kasih dan selamat sore.
Terima kasih, Rahmat. Terima kasih. Thanks, Rahmat. That was an insightful analysis of what is happening in Indonesia vis-a-vis events in the Philippines and of the rest of Asia. So thank you very much. Now it is time to hear from the participants. I think we have questions and comments raised to our three panelists. So let us go through them. Okay.
Hello, do we have to answer now?
Hindi ba nakamute?
Yes, yes. We are open to question and answer, and we have many questions. And please go ahead and answer the questions.
Yeah. Question number one. Question number one. Pwede mo sagutin. Ito.
So I'm supposed to answer the question concerning U.S. and China cooperation against the interests of the Filipino people, and then in the struggle for national liberation and democracy. The U.S. and China have had tested cooperation since 1978, at least, even before they became partners in promoting the neoliberal policy of imperialist globalization. they cooperated against Chinese labor, against the Chinese working class. So they agreed that China would engage in sweatshop operations to take advantage of the cheap labor of the Chinese workers. And so when it comes to taking advantage of the people of another country like the Philippines, it has been quite easy for them to operate. But you know, especially when China had become stronger after the Tiananmen event of 1989, and it was able to get concessions, further concessions from the US for more outsourcing of manufacturers to be made in China, and for more investments to be made in China by the US. So there has always been cooperation between US and China. The Chinese could dump their products in the Philippines, although the Chinese had not become the number one investor and number one trading partner for quite some time. But China has been developing it as an advantage over other nationalities, foreign nationalities, in that they are the Filipino-Chinese businessmen, bourgeois, Filipino-Chinese, cooperating with their big comprador counterparts on the other side of the China Sea. So there has been an element of cooperation and contention between the US and China. And for, I think, more than 4 decades, especially under the neoliberal policy regime, cooperation was more prominent. It is only now, in recent years, that the contention aspect has become prominent, especially since 2017, when the US strategy planners pointed out that China was a dangerous economic competitor and political rival of the US. And then by 2018, Trump was already asserting the need for decoupling, or at least reducing certain advantages which China had been able to get in its collaboration with the US. So, but let us look at their cooperation in the Philippines. So recent an event like the destruction of Marawi City, you will observe there that the US and China delivered weapons to the Philippine government to destroy Marawi. They saw the Chinese provided the small arms, and the US provided the air cover and the drones. And that was a setup. The destruction of Marawi City was a setup. It was long suspected as a haven of leaders of the several moral liberation movements, and it was suspected as some kind of an armory for those movements. So the US and the pro-US military officers decided to set up Marawi City for destruction. And Duterte made a deal with one of the Maute brothers that the Maute brothers would start the incident. So there was a setup. And then Marawi City became a focal point for the application of the assistance of 2 imperialist powers to the Duterte regime. So there you see the cooperation even in military terms. China has an interest in the destruction of the revolutionary movement. That's why it has been silent, no? Despite all its pretensions of having a communist party. It's, of course, it's a bogus communist party. It has not expressed any sympathy for the Philippine revolutionary movement. So that is a sign that the big bourgeoisie the monopoly bourgeoisie is in power in China. And insofar as it is the big bourgeois partner of the U.S., they collude and they desire, Deng Xiaoping liquidated the armed revolutionary movements in Southeast Asia in the name of peace and development for the region, and that is in the service of the imperialist ambitions of China. And that suited also U.S. imperialism. So there's collaboration there between two imperialist powers. We must grasp the point that the imperialist powers, including Soviet social imperialism, were able to avoid direct war among themselves. And the solution had always been for them to shift the burden of crisis to the underdeveloped countries and to the oppressed nations and peoples. That has been and they have been able to use the UN and multilateral agencies like the IMF, World Bank, the GATT arrangement, and then, of course, WTO in later times. So the imperialist powers connive against the oppressed peoples and nations while they compete economically and even become political rivals. East Asia is not a stranger to imperialist powers collaborating and then eventually fighting a war. Japan used to be the deputy of Anglo-American imperialist power in East Asia. And so Japan was actually encouraged to fight Russia and, to expand. But then came the time when the crisis of the 1930s came, and Japan in the 1920s was known as the Fuggerman of Anglo-American power. But by the 30s, contradictions arose between Japan and its Western allies, and fascism took over in Japan, and the crisis then would lead to World War II. So it's not strange for imperialist powers to collaborate against other people, especially those they can oppress and exploit for their mutual benefit, and at the same time maintain their contradictions. So that's the case. My direct answer to the question is, of course, as they have united against the Filipino people, they can still unite against the Filipino people, even if they have now problems of decoupling and U.S. trying to cut down the concessions and advantages it gave to China before. It is afraid that China's rising power would reduce the U.S. to a very secondary position. But that's a fight among imperialist powers. But they have a common interest in exploiting the Filipino people, like other peoples whose countries serve as mere sources of raw materials, and who are buyers of the manufacturers of these imperialist powers.
Thank you, Professor Sison. I have a question for Renato. How did you come up and developed your program for national democracy? Is it something that changes over time, or is it set on stone?
Hi. Okay, so I think the program has been there since the various progressive and revolutionary groups decided in the 60s to pursue the new democratic revolution. If history serves me right, initially that it was a 10-point program, then it became a 12-point program. It evolves, but it had to come from the analysis of the objective conditions of Philippine society. Being a semi-feudal and semi-colonial society in an era of imperialism, what would be the logical course or direction of the ND struggle. So that's where the program came from. So it dates back from the 60s, early 70s. But as we have seen, the crisis has caused more problems, more issues, and the program will have to also address those as we go along. So yeah, it's also dynamic. It's also recognizing the current situation, but at the same time, it's very firm when it comes to the basic principles, class characteristics, the socialist perspective, and so on.
Thanks, Renato. Thanks for that. The next question is to Professor Joma. Other leftists in the Philippines, which is not ND, believe that our country is a capitalist one already, which is why they say ND alternative isn't applicable to Philippine conditions anymore. How can we answer or argue against this? Prof, your...
And
yeah.
inter-island trade developed due to crop specialization in the production of staple food products and export crops. The capitalist commodity system had already taken hold of the Philippines. So in that sense, in the sense of merchant capitalism, capitalist commodity system had already begun to undermine the feudal economy of natural self-sufficiency in localities and regions. Money would begin to be used extensively, but it would take the American period to open the minds and further expand foreign trade and, of course, make the roads and bridges for enhancing the exchange of raw materials in the form of export crops and mineral ores for exchange with foreign manufacturers. And so whereas in the 19th century, the big compradors were the friar states and the Spanish colonial officials and merchants, in the 20th century, when the U.S. developed what we would call semi-feudalism, or in another expression, comprador capitalism. There's no problem in the use of the term capitalism if those who insist on using the term capitalism would simply say comprador capitalism, because what makes the semi-feudal system distinct from a purely or mainly feudal system is that it's no longer the rent-taking landlord class that is the chief ruling class, but it is the big comprador landlord class. It is a kind of capitalist class, a merchant capitalist class, but it's strong basing in feudalism. We'll consider, let us say, the Ayala, the group of Spanish mestizo families, like the Ayala, Sorianos, Rojases, and the like. While they are big comprador owners of banks and big export-import trading companies, they have big haciendas in Nasugbu and Calatagan. And consider also Eduardo Juanco, the latest personality, representative of the comprador big bourgeoisie. He owned a bank, he owned the biggest comprador brewery company, importing malt to make beer and importing the equipment to make beer. But he at the same time owned 20 haciendas all over the Philippines. So there is no problem. If you say, when Mao was asked before the victory of the Chinese Revolution in 1949, isn't China capitalist? Isn't it part of the world capitalist system? And Mao said, yes, it is part of the world capitalism, and you can call it capitalist because the commodity system of production and exchange was already in application. But there is a certain precision in the term semi-feudalism. You don't get that precision from the general and vague term capitalism. You can only make it sharp when you say it's big comprador-dominated capitalism. Yes, you can use that as the equivalent of semi-feudalism. But the precision of the term semi-feudalism is the linkage of that merchant capitalism to its feudal basing. And, you know, in the Philippines, agriculture still accounts for the biggest part of production among the productive sectors, but it is understated because what the peasants and farm workers consume are not properly accounted. And then only when employment in agriculture is accounted for, they only account for the heads of families, but they forget that the entire peasant family is the workforce. So right now, bourgeois economists, including Sokdems and Trotskyites, try to minimize the peasant aspect, the agriculture aspect. And they would like to make it appear that the Philippines is already industrial capitalist. For anyone to say that the Philippines is already industrial capitalist or a newly industrialized country, they are lying. No? Those are liars saying that. So the interest in, there is a counter-revolutionary ulterior motive why some people keep on would like to use the vague term capitalism instead of the very precise term semi-feudalism. They wish to liquidate the People's War because the protracted People's War is based on the reality that the peasantry is still the majority class in the Philippines, and it provides the social terrain together with the physical terrain of the countryside for People's War in order to resist imperialism, feudalism, and bureaucrat capitalism. And mind you, the degree of imported mechanization in haciendas is very small, and big haciendas still use the traditional seasonal farm workers to make production. The overwhelming majority of peasants in the Philippines are poor peasants, and they are the basis also of the traditional farm workers who work not only for haciendas but for rich peasants and most landlords. The big comprador landlords are the cream of the landlord class, and the more numerous landlord class spread out throughout the country are the traditional ones collecting rent. And the land reform programs undertaken in the Philippines since the American period have been bogus. So the preliminary step is to break up the friar states and subsequently big landlord states to say, oh, we will distribute the land to the poor peasants, to the tenants. But then the redistribution price for the land is so unaffordable to the peasants. One sickness in the family, one natural bad weather, one natural calamity, and the peasants completely lose the chance of paying for the redistribution price. So all these land reform programs have been used to distribute land among the landlords. And in the absence of real industrial development in the Philippines, the surplus product of agriculture has nowhere to go but for further accumulation of land by the landlords and for expanding commercial operations. So that's the case in the Philippines. The precise term is semi-feudalism, or if you wish, call it big comprador-dominated capitalism, but simply the general term capitalism is misleading, it is vague. It tries to cover up the fact that the Philippines still has a feudalism as the basis of the entire economy. I hope that that will be enough to explain the difference between the term, the vague term capitalism and semi-feudalism. I'm stressing the precision involved in the use of the term semi-feudalism.
Thanks, Prof. Joma. Now we have a question for Renato and Joma. Is it right to call Philippines as a US-China Duterte regime? Are US and China having the same level of influence in the Philippines, or is it important to point out who is the primary and secondary between the two?
I'll defer to Professor Sito.
Joma?
Ikaw mo una.
Ano?
Ikaw mo una.
Okay. I take it. I have no objections. Some people use US-China Duterte regime because he's really trying to serve two imperialist masters, and each imperialist power has its own distinctive weight. The US has distinctive weight because still the #1 imperialist power. China is also distinctive, but because here is one imperialist power that is practically used aggression against international law to take over to make the 7 artificial islands and have turned these artificial islands into foreign military bases. So China, in a sense, is even more privileged than the US. The US was deprived officially, formally, of US military bases in 1991, but here is China having 7 military bases. So in that sense, China is a dangerous power rising, and it is in the clear case of the Philippines that China proves China as an extraterritorial imperialist power aggressing. That's the significance of China's takeover of maritime features of the exclusive economic zone of the Philippines. But still, U.S. is #1. When the U.S. asserts itself, I think we will see that China will be cut down, and then it is up to China to react. Whether China itself is a complicated thing. Yeah, the bourgeoisie has already completely taken over. It has taken over the state system and the state economy. At the same time, it has developed the private monopoly capitalist class, and they are brothers. Those who belong to the state and to the private corporations are brothers and cousins, and so they belong to the same family. So it's I think capitalism in China has gone deep, much deeper than, say, the mafias during the time of Brezhnev, down to the time of Gorbachev. The takeover of capitalism in China is more deep going. But at the same time, you have China with the experience of the GPR, and there are supposed to be many Maoist parties and organizations opposing the system. And so if let us say, in the course of US-China conflict, we have to see whether the bourgeoisie will throw away its pretension of being communist, throw away the flag as in the Soviet Union, or there is a rise up. If there is China has practically outmaneuvered itself by trying to make this Belt and Road Initiative, making an empire, imperial roots on land, no? And then, but you see, in the long term, there will be more contradictions developing with the nationalities and governments in Central Asia. China will have difficulty making profits and collecting the interest payments from the loans it has made to countries in Africa and South Asia. And now, on the other hand, in the Indo-Pacific route, that means to say the connection between the Pacific Ocean, especially South China Sea, and the Indian Ocean, you see Japan and India linking up with the U.S. sponsoring that, with the U.S. coming from the Pacific Ocean side, no? So that is there is a conflict developing between this land-based empire reminiscent of ancient history and the current flow of 60% of world trade on the Indo-Pacific maritime route, no? And I think China will come up with the resistance not only of the Western powers and Japan, but also the resistance of Southeast Asia and eventually the whole of South Asia with India. And you know, the U.S. is now trying to manipulate India against China, and that will have you know, people ask with Trump being anti-immigrant, where will he get the cheap labor to revive American manufacturing? How to make in America, made in America be realized, be accomplished? But you know, in the meantime, while there is a shift of U.S. and other imperialist subsidiaries in China, the ship is towards India in the meantime, because there is cheap labor there too. And so you have a very fluid situation. China is actually begging for the continuance of cooperation between China and U.S. and Trump is insistent. Whoever wins in the elections, I think the ground is already laid by what you might call the deep state in the U.S. There's the strategic planners behind the scenes, behind the Democratic and the Republican Party. You see, even in the time of Obama, there was already a consciousness at the level of the presidency that U.S. has to be careful of China. That's why the what you call the Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement was proposed without China, no? Proposed by the U.S. without China, and then the strategic pivot, no? To East Asia was already decided during the time of Obama, and only for a short while, 2016 to 2017, Trump was quiet about, he even appeared as being against the Trans-Pacific Initiative without China. So, but by 2018, Trump would be guided already by what I referred to as the 2017 national strategy paper made by the U.S. strategic planners. So you see here, there will be, I think, the best thing that can be expected is that there will be some mutual damage between the two imperialist powers. But anyway, going back to the question, if somebody says U.S. Duterte regime, that's fine. That means to say that is to stress the U.S. is the #1 imperialist power dominating the Philippines. But if someone says U.S.-China, it's also okay with me. You know, Chinese history provides the example of one country being sliced up like a melon by several imperialist powers. There was no singling out of an imperialist power, out of so many imperialist powers, cutting up China like a melon in pre-revolutionary China. But then there came a time when Kuomintang became so close to Anglo-American power. So reference to the Kuomintang would involve referring to Anglo-American power. Then, after the war, when the U.S. became dominant, you can see literature saying U.S. Chiang regime. So these are terms that can be used, provided you provide the concrete explanation. No? And I think it's permissible for me to say U.S., China, Duterte regime. It's a bit elongated, no? But for the sake of simplicity, U.S. Duterte will be fine, because, you know, Duterte has been pretending to be so pro-China as to be anti-U.S., but he is actually, it depends on what basis is he being for this or that imperialist power. He's definitely pro-U.S. On top of being pro-China when it comes to wishing to kill the revolutionary movement in the Philippines, and in assuring the #1 power, it is assuring 100% ownership of Philippine land, natural resources, public utilities, and so on, is the U.S. But of course, all other imperialist powers will benefit from that kind of charter change. Now, China makes itself prominent only because it is a new rising aggressor with the only military bases that formally exist in the Philippines. And the Duterte regime has been so stupid, no, that to put two increasingly conflicting imperialist powers to be using the same puppet military camps. I was, some military officers of the AFP brought out the complete text of the agreements between China Telecom, Dito Telecommunity, and the military. They are not just going to put up cell towers, which can be used for spying on the communications of the U.S. and China, with U.S. and the Philippine puppets. No? In the contract, the China Telecom and Dito Telecommunity are also supposed to help in developing the communications of the armed forces of the Philippines. So you have very stupid rulers in the Philippines, a stupid president and stupid generals. I think they're getting confused, which imperialist power to really follow. And they have And so much the better for the revolutionary movement. If they get confused, they go crazy trying to satisfy two conflicting imperialist powers.
Thank you, Prof. Joma. That was very insightful and very insightful in terms of the political analysis. Thank you for that. Because we are running out of time, we will only ask one more question, and all other questions will be forwarded to our speakers, and they will answer them through the Facebook. So the last question for Joma and Nato is, can you give a brief comment on the recent Trotskyite attacks to the ND movement and its supposed role of enabler of Duterte?
May I? If Nato wants to speak ahead, okay with me.
Okay, Renato?
Go ahead, Joe. Brief comment. No?
Well,
Brief comment.
The attacks, no? Maybe I can take the initiative, no? Let's look at Trotsky. Trotsky was a glib talker and a glib writer, but he never studied Marxist philosophy, political economy, and social science the way, let's say, Lenin or Stalin did. In the early years of the 20th century, Trotsky ingratiated himself to the proletarian revolutionaries, to the Bolsheviks, by being such a good stage performer, speaking and then writing articles, but he never did any systematic theorizing. And so, because he was a standout, he was given certain functions. And when he was given a function, he usually, when he could appear to perform well if he followed the instructions already decided by the Central Committee of the Bolsheviks, and when it comes to military affairs, by the Bolshevik military experts, as well as military officers coming from the Tsarist army who changed sides. So, but then when a clear example, when Trotsky was given the function of being responsible for running after Denikin, he had the strange idea of holding back from making an offensive on Denikin in the Urals, and that was against the instruction of the Central Committee. So he was eventually fired from the front, no? But anyway, Lenin described Trotsky as some kind of a jerk, no? Who would move from who would worm his way into any crevice, any difference between two sides, and he would flip-flop from the Iskra side to the economy side, and so on and so on. And so he was a very unstable because he was an unremolded, practically an unremolded petty bourgeois, with fond of ultra-left slogans, but without understanding the basis for revolutionary principles and policies. And so he got into his last trouble during the time of Stalin, when the Soviet Union was already carrying out the program of socialist industry, socialist industrialization, and the collectivization and mechanization of agriculture. Trotsky kept on insisting that it was impossible to build socialism in one country, and it was necessary to wait out for the permanent revolution, supposed permanent revolution, which involved simultaneous revolutions all over the world. But then he got, and he practically said that socialism was impossible simply because the expected revolution in Germany did not occur. The German Revolution was defeated in 1919, no? And so from then on, he was actually disappointed, and he kept on spreading defeatism. So he engaged in counter-revolutionary activities when he led the so-called left opposition, which was the other side of the right opposition of Bukharin. But anyway, Trotsky got imperialist funding in order to oppose the socialist revolution in the Soviet Union, and then Konrad Ho Chi Minh exposed very well in his piece how Trotskyites had become spies in his time. They had become spies in Indochina, in Germany, and Spain. They sided with the Nazi and so on and so forth. And then in my own time, I still caught up with J. Gladstone as a special agent of the CIA, specialized in labor affairs. So I'm well acquainted with the Trotskyites trying to impinge on the Philippines. There were several attempts before for Trotskyites to penetrate the revolutionary movement, but they were repulsed every time. Now, these are the wrong ideas of Trotsky. He's against the role of the Communist Party as the vanguard party to lead the proletariat. He is against stages. He wants to finish things in one fell swoop. So he's against the two-stage revolution, democratic, and then socialist, especially in the underdeveloped countries like the Philippines. And then he's permanent, the Trotskyites are permanently wedded to this nonsense about permanent revolution occurring all at one time as a seamless kind of thing. So it is something they always talk about that is going to develop in the future. Anyway, to be short, what is this? So far, the Trotskyites have remained small groups, grouplets. In the Philippines, they still have some grouplets, and the world over, they magnify themselves by using the online, the media, the social media. In short, the Trotskyites, for all their arrogance at being more revolutionary than revolutionaries who are actually in the heat of struggle, they have not made any revolution anywhere except some incidents of adventurism, say in Mexico or in Sri Lanka. But after all those incidents, they have been reduced to practically nothing.
Thank you. Thank you, Joma. That was, better understanding of what's the Trotskyites up to, and and the political aspect of it.
Can I add to the discussion? Is it okay? Do we still have time?
Yeah, I have one more question.
We still have time. Yeah. Can I still
You
add
want to
to what has
respond?
been said?
Yes, sure.
Yeah. Just a short response.
So,
So
yeah, sure.
the recent attacks come at a time when the Filipino people and the mass movement and the opposition are trying to build a broad united front against Duterte. And now some personalities and some groups seemingly trying to put a wedge within the united front by attacking those belonging to the National Democratic Movement. It's also very dishonest. No? Any honest academic can read for himself or herself what has happened the past 4 years and debunk the patently dishonest claims made by the Trotskyites and their followers. For example, they misrepresent the peace negotiations as collaboration when the very nature of having peace negotiations is because there's an ongoing armed conflict. No? So how can that be at any point collaboration when the armed conflict has not been resolved and neither of the parties have laid down their arms? It's just wrong. It's patently dishonest to say that it is collaboration. Then these personalities also go on to say that, oh, the revolutionary movement, they're spent force, they're weak, they're small, they have been overtaken by events and so on. They're no longer relevant. Yet at the same time, they make this assertion that the revolutionary forces Duterte at the start of his term from carrying out all these evil acts. So I think that's very absurd because you claim that the revolutionary movement is a spent force. They're insignificant, yet you also expect them to be the ones who are going to stop Duterte in his tracks at the first during his first year. You know? So again, that's a very dishonest appraisal of what has happened. The reality is, even during the period of the peace negotiations, even when there were members of the progressive movement in the Duterte cabinet, there was no week that passed that the activists were not in the streets fighting for the demands of the people. And records will show that the ND movement has been the most serious in mobilizing the people against the Duterte regime. The ND activists have been at the forefront of the resistance and have shed blood. So many activists have been arrested, have been killed, have been subjected to militarization, have been displaced. It would be very unfair and again dishonest to claim that these activists were the enablers of the regime when records will show that they have been the most consistent critics of the administration.
Thank you, Nato. Okay, we're running out of time, but there's one last question, which is quite, it's very interesting. And this is actually meant for both Joma and Nato. And the question is, what is the prospect of ousting Duterte before his term ends? And how do you see the scenario of the vice president becoming president in the context of the release of all political prisoners and resumption of peace talks?
What is your prospect?
Go ahead, Joe.
Okay, there is a good prospect in ousting Duterte. There he has certain vulnerabilities. Number one, it is well known, he's very sick, physically, mentally, and of course morally. And the latest report about his illness is that you know, this reflux, this going back of things he eats to his esophagus is resulting in cancer. And of course, he has old problems about, being able to let out his dirt. That's why he needs now more frequent dialysis. And then, of course, his broken back, his broken spine. That's a problem for him. And of course, he has a certain muscular and nervous problems. That's why he keeps on pressing his forehead when he appears. And of course, the point that he has very dirty blood. You can see it in his face. He looks ashen all the time when he appears in public. He doesn't appear before the public as frequently as before. He disappears for weeks, and when he appears, he looks sick. So that is not a very inspiring status and appearance of a leader who thinks he is strong. He evokes the image of weakness and vulnerability. In the barracks among his own military men, they make fun of him as a namby-pamby, pasinto-sinto, and especially those military officers who don't eat money from him. So they have contempt for the kind of president that they have, and for a good reason. Even within the military, the majority are against the pro-Duterte officers. The pro-Duterte officers are already confused how they deal with their two imperialist masters. And the majority of military officers are patriotic on one side and pro-US, but anti-China, no? So together they form a majority against the crazy ones who are to try to be pro-US and pro-China. And then Duterte has undermined himself after stealing so much money, public money before COVID-19. He made use of the last 6 months of COVID-19 pandemic to steal, to steal the ayuda that should have gone to the millions of people. The money that should go for the medical attention to treatment of people, he pocketed the money. And then you have scandalous incidents where, a few millions worth of dolomite, granulated dolomite, it's presented as worth 385 or 389 million pesos. So, the thievery, the plundering is so obvious. And another thing, he's failing in his promise to the US to destroy the revolutionary movement. Every time that the New People's Army makes a counter-offensive or makes offensives on its own initiative, all the lies that comes out from the commercial media every day about NPA getting killed or surrendering or submitting themselves to whatever socioeconomic racket of military officers, these are easily exposed. And so there are certain possibilities. Robredo, as the constitutional successor, can get enough support from the military. And the best situation is for the gigantic mass actions to arise, because people are very angry at the Duterte regime. It's now possible to have mass actions similar to those that ousted Marcos in the period of 83 to 86. Now, but we cannot be too certain about the best possibility of combining the constitutional successor, the majority of military officers, and the gigantic mass actions. That's the best thing that can happen. But the US can also convince, because Duterte is surrounded by pro-US officers like Lorenzana, Año, Esperon. He can be convinced if the US would really move, to order its puppets around the big puppet, Duterte. They can tell Duterte to step down and let the constitutional successor take over. And that would preempt the gigantic mass actions. Well, another possibility, but I wouldn't suggest betting on it because it will discourage people from doing what they can do, no? Duterte will just kick the bucket because of his illnesses, but that's it's best to rely on one's ability to act in the interest of the people. So now, with regard to the constitutional successor paving her way and at least allowing herself to consolidate her position, well, it would be a good idea for Robredo to release all political prisoners, as Cory Aquino did before, after the fall of Marcos. And then the release of the political prisoners, the amnesty and release of the political prisoners could be the preliminary to serious peace negotiations. So much has been done and accomplished in the peace negotiations that it will not be difficult to let us say make the comprehensive agreement on social and economic reforms and then proceed to the two other possible comprehensive agreements, because in this last few years the drafts of these comprehensive agreements have been under preparation, and the document on CASER is well developed and can be agreed upon so easily. So now it is necessary for the successor of Duterte to be mindful of how much the crisis of the ruling system and the world capitalist system has become so bad, no? And the constitutional successor has to make sure that he has the broadest possible unity to support her presidency. And it would do well for Robredo to resume the peace negotiations with the National Democratic Front of the Philippines. In whichever case, in whichever way Duterte can be removed from office, I think the constitutional successor should surely consider how to make reconciliation and peace with the revolutionary movement for the benefit of our people.
Thank you, Prof. Nato, you want to add?
The situation right now is very, very different from the situation 4 years ago. And I think the COVID-19 crisis and the economic downturn has really exposed fundamental weaknesses of the Duterte regime and its inability to solve the crisis. The president appears once a week to the public. It has become some kind of proof of life event, and the people are really dissatisfied with the way he has responded. And I think people are seeing that they're seeing no real government social amelioration program for those economically displaced, those who are going hungry. They're seeing that press the people. The past 5 or 6 months have shown us very intense struggles in the coming months. And that is where the solidarity of our friends
Thank you, Nato. Thanks. Thank you. So I would like to round up and thank our great set of panelists. Thank you, Prof. Joma, Renato, and Ramat. Thank you so much. You have raised important points and expounded on the importance and the program of the National Democratic Revolution in the Philippines. That was tremendous. I would also like to thank Atama Katama for the interpretation from English to Bahasa and vice versa. So thank you, Atama. Thank you to all the participants who have made this very relevant and interesting questions and comments. And we will, the speakers will try to answer to the questions that were not answered here in the Facebook as much as possible. But before we stop, I would also like to invite all of you to attend the third part of the webinar series entitled Peace Negotiations and People's War in the Philippines, Lessons and Prospects on September 18, 2020 at 6 o'clock Philippine time. All other events that are part of the Solidarity Month for the Philippines are posted on the ILPS Facebook page. Do like and share our page. We hope to see you again, and let us continue to show our solidarity to our Filipino brothers and sisters as they struggle for liberation, democracy, justice, human rights, and peace. Thank you. Thank you very much, everyone, and see you soon. Bye.